Thanks, Kelly, as always. Um, so, welcome back, everybody. Thanks everyone who's made it to week two. We're a quarter of the way there. Not yet, but we will be in an hour. Um, uh, so the plan, just to make sure we're all on the same page, the plan for today is I want to talk largely about Genesis 1. And at the end, I'll talk about the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And then Genesis 2, thinking about it sort of on its own for its own sake, along with Genesis 3, we're going to do next time for the Garden of Eden session. So we're sort of Genesis 2 is kind of going to straddle the two sessions this week and next. I realize that it feels like we're going very slowly, and at this rate, we're only going to get through Genesis 8. But I promise we're going to pick up steam as we go. I mean, by the end, we're going to be doing almost entire books at a time. It's going to be great. Okay. So, again, I want to encourage people to use the chat to ask questions as we go along. There's no possible way to cover everything there is to say, even about like a single chapter in the minimal time that we have here. So please put the questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to get to most of them at the end of my talkings. I do want to begin by mentioning a question that was asked in the chat the last time that we didn't have a chance to get to, but I thought was a really great question and something I wanted to encourage as a sort of a line of inquiry. There was a question in there about sort of, somebody said I was brought up, in a sort of traditional, with a traditional understanding of the Bible as being, the true word of God, et cetera, et cetera. How do I reconcile that with what we're doing here? For some of you, that's going to be like kind of the topic for these sessions, is how to reconcile faith and the more academic sort of critical view that I'm going to be bringing over the course of these sessions. Like, obviously, it is not my intention in these sessions to try and undermine anybody's faith, but there are some faiths, I mean, I would say most, certainly including my own, that make claims about the Bible that don't quite work with sort of standard biblical critical scholarship. And so I just want to say off the bat, as a sort of way of framing this, I really truly believe that what we're doing here and the kind of work that I do is like this kind of reading isn't actually challenging the Bible in any way. It's really honoring the Bible. We're taking the text incredibly seriously, like as it is as a text, as it stands. And obviously, all the interpretive traditions that go along with various faiths are interpreting the text, and they are fitting the Bible in a lot of senses to fit their various interpretive needs. It's respect for the text, certainly, but maybe a different kind of respect for the text. And so the kind of respect that I'm going to be doing here is respecting the text for its own sake, without trying to think of it as, through some of the more traditional ways of understanding what it is or what it means, right? I'm going to try and let the text speak a little bit for itself outside of those approaches, which is just something to keep in mind as we sort of like tootle along through the text over the next few weeks. Okay, so Genesis 1. Let's begin with the beginning. That is, what's being created and what's already there. And I'm not going to concentrate on the first verse because we talked about that a little bit last time. But the second verse gives us the sort of background clause to what the world was like when God began the process of creating it. So what's there? The world may be this chaotic mess, right? The famous Hebrew phrase tohu vavohu. The world may be a chaotic mess, but there's already darkness, right? And there's already water. Those are the things that exist from the get-go. And there's also this sort of divine wind, which we, is comes from God that is over the water. I realize we just started. I'm going to take a small detour to tell a story. because every time I read this verse about the wind over the water, I think of it. There was a time in my life when, for reasons that no need to go into, I had to take a sort of introduction to Judaism class, mostly for people who were thinking about converting to Judaism. And I was well into being a biblical scholar at this point, but there I was in the class. And one of the exercises that the teacher had everybody do was to read a portion of the Bible and sort of think about what it might mean. And we were given these first few verses from Genesis 1. And so we all broke into small groups and we came back with questions and we were chatting about it. And somebody raised their hand and said, when it says that the wind from God was sort of hovering over the water, like how high over the water was it hovering? And like inside, I was like, oh, this is actually a really good opportunity for the teacher to talk about, kinds of questions we ask and literal meaning. And the teacher went, about this high. And I didn't go back to the class after that. All right, that's but I think of it every time I come to this to this chapter. Okay, in this creation story in Genesis 1, what we're really talking about and what the chapter is really doing is separating and categorizing. That's the work of creation that we see here. So what's being separated? Light is being separated from dark. The water is being separated, right, above and below. Right, if you read the text, right, God creates a space in between the water above and the water below, and then separating water from land, so that the water is sort of gathered into what we now call seas, and the land appears. Day is separated from night. So there's a process of separation is sort of the primary task. And then there's categorizing. Creation categorizes types of plants and trees, the sea creatures, all the creepy crawlies, the birds, the animals. They're all created in their sort of categories of life. And the result is that the whole chapter is really the creation of order out of chaos, of creating space and then filling it in this really well-structured story. And the chart I've just put up shows, right, days 1 through 3 is the creation of sort of spaces, water, sky, land, even light to a certain extent. And then days 4, 5, and 6, right, populate those spaces. So the dark and the light are populated by the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the waters in the sky are populated in day 5 with the fish and the birds. And obviously on day 6, the land is populated with all of the land animals, including humans. One of the things you might have noticed when reading, or perhaps not, is there's a distinction made in the text between how life and various entities here generate themselves. So God creates on day 3 the land, and the vegetation that grows on the land. It says the earth brings that forth. Right, the earth brings forth vegetation. The seas bring forth fish. The land brings forth animals. Right, so there's this concept in the creation here of God sets something in motion. It doesn't require a constant hands-on thing. These are entities that sort of replenish themselves. The counter to that is the entities that God brings forth. God brings forth the eternal things. God brings forth the light and the heavens and the sea and the land and the sun and the moon and the stars and humans, right? Humans are also in the category of the things that God has to be active in creating. The land doesn't bring forth humans the way it does domestic animals or wild beasts or creepy things. So right from the way that it talks about how creation works, humanity is set apart as sort of categorically different, even though it is still just one of the sort of land animals created on day 1, or on day 6 rather. Okay, that was my incredibly brief overview of sort of like how the chapter works structurally and conceptually. And what I want to do for really the rest of the time is dig a little bit deeper into various pockets of the story, and see if there's stuff there that we can find that's perhaps not obvious to the naked eye. And the first thing that's decidedly not obvious to the naked eye unless you know about it is that this fundamental biblical text, right? The creation of Genesis 1, central theological text with, in the opening line, maybe the most famous sentence in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This text that we think of and has been forever so central um, to the Bible and to its interpretation, the whole chapter is not particularly unique to the Bible. Uh, you can only imagine, after however many thousands, hundreds of years of this being such a central passage, in 1849, so again, not that long ago, in 1849, when the Mesopotamian texts began to be discovered. And this one that is on the screen now is the Mesopotamian creation myth known as Enuma Elish for its first couple of words, which translate to "when on high." Um, this must have been, I mean, we know it was an incredible shock to the system to discover that in Mesopotamia, from maybe 1,000 years earlier than our biblical texts, uh, here was a creation account that looked disturbingly similar to Genesis 1 in various ways. So I'm just going to point out some of the ways that this is the case. Like Genesis 1, Enuma Elish begins with this notion of the earth being a watery chaos. So Apsu is the sort of deity of the primeval waters. And Tiamat is the Mesopotamian deity of like the ocean deeps, the watery deeps. And they mingled their waters together. In the beginning, there was nothing but watery chaos, essentially, right? No cane brake was intertwined, nor thicket, right? There was no culture, there was nothing to hold anything together, just watery chaos. And this is the sort of thing you have to be slightly familiar with Hebrew for, but I'll point it out. Tiamat, the Mesopotamian watery deep deity, is the same word as the Hebrew word in Genesis for, right, the darkness over the surface of the deep. That Hebrew word is Tehom, which comes directly from the Mesopotamian deity name Tiamat. So again, for people discovering this text, saying, "Oh man, we like this word that we all simply thought in Hebrew meant the deeps is actually like comes from a Mesopotamian deity." What else is similar between the Enuma Elish from Mesopotamia and Genesis 1? Well, in both of them, we have creation via the word. So the just as God says, "Let there be light," and there's light, so too in Enuma Elish, he commanded, and at his word, right, things are created and destroyed. So again, one of the central claims of the biblical creation story is, right, God creates by just speaking. Yes, not uniquely though. What else? How is heaven created? Heaven is created in the biblical account by sort of taking the sort of expanse or a firmament, it's often called, and separating the water above from the water below. Same basic thing is happening in the Mesopotamian account, except instead of it being sort of a generic kind of firmament, it's the body of Tiamat, the now defeated goddess that is the structure for the firmament, this vault that keeps the heavens up. In both Mesopotamian and biblical, we have the creation of the heavenly bodies, right? The sun and the moon and the stars. And not only are they created, they're created in order to serve calendrical functions, right? To mark the year and to set up the months, just as in Genesis, they're up there to serve as signs for the set times and the days and the years. And finally, of course, the creation of people, of humanity. God says, "Let us make man." And in Enuma Elish, it's similarly, I'm going to cause bones to be, I'm going to make a human being stand up, and we're going to call it man. I'm going to create humankind. Um, and one more similarity, In Genesis 1, obviously very famously, God says, let's make man in our image, after our likeness. And in Enuma Elish, the same. The humans are supposed to be sort of like doubles of the gods. This is a brief run through of some of the similarities between these two accounts. But again, as soon as this text was discovered, it was understood there has to be a relationship of some sort between the Mesopotamian creation account and the biblical one. But how are we going to define that relationship? It's not like two authors who happen to like both witness the same event, right, and like wrote down their notes about it, right? They obviously, the relationship between these is not that they're both based in the same historical reality. This must be a cultural or a literary relationship. So is it that Israel and Mesopotamia have a common cultural heritage that's responsible for both of these creation stories? Is it that the author of the biblical account sort of had some experience of Mesopotamian culture and ideas and adopted them? Is it possible that the biblical author knew the actual text of Enuma Elish, of the Mesopotamian creation story, and copied it? To go further, is it possible that the author knew the text of the Mesopotamian account and wrote the biblical account as a sort of conscious polemic against the Mesopotamian one? So took this text, was full of many deities, and said, no, we're going to make it only one deity. And your deity that was the once the deep, I'm just going to turn into the natural phenomenon of the deeps. And I'm going to change all these things and adopting and adapting your creation story to sort of reject it and say, no, not like this, but the way we think it happened. And that polemic is a pretty common view of how these two things are related. I want to push back a little bit and suggest that the problem with that idea, and maybe even with the entire question about how they relate to each other, is that we end up taking these two texts and asking about each of them only, how do I compare them, right? What's different? What's the same, right? If I read it from the biblical perspective, what is different about the Mesopotamian one? And then it becomes a whole game of just finding parallels between the two. And then we start asking the questions that I was sort of just asking. Who influenced whom, right? How did one text react to another one? And this can become a very fraught conversation. Actually, soon after all the Mesopotamian texts were discovered in the middle of the 19th century, a huge controversy erupted in biblical and Mesopotamian studies called the Bible versus Babel or Babylon controversy, where those on the Bible side, who were mainly conservative Christian types, looked at this and said, oh, yes, well, the Mesopotamian texts may be older, but the biblical texts clearly outdo them in moral and ethical understanding and are such an obvious cultural advance on these primitive Mesopotamian, myths. And the people on the Babylon side said, no, Babylon was clearly the much more advanced civilization, and the biblical authors are just, lightly borrowing and, had no ideas of their own. Obviously, the answer is somewhere in the middle. But, the real question is, when we compare texts like this, what are we trying to get out of it? How is it helping us to read the biblical text, to look at this Mesopotamian text that seems so similar? Part of what we can do is ask, okay, which parts of Genesis 1 really look like they could be, like they're Mesopotamian and not Israelite, right? What stuff in there is just foreign somehow? And I'm not sure that there's really anything, right? We can look at the word Tehom, the deeps, and the deity Tiamat and say, oh, I can see how there was a connection there. But the biblical text doesn't have a deity in it named Tiamat. The Genesis 1 speaks to an Israelite audience who, with an Israelite worldview and theology. In other words, I think no Israelite would read Genesis 1 and be like, aha, take that, Mesopotamia. We really showed you how creation was done. This was simply part of how they thought of creation. At least some of them did. My point is essentially that the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 are in a sense each the sort of culturally specific manifestation of a kind of Platonic ideal creation story that both were drawing on. And the one of them is the Mesopotamian manifestation, and Genesis 1 is like the Israelite manifestation of this common cultural creation story that sort of permeated probably the region over a millennium or more. Having said all that, I don't think there's any question that sort of this creation story originated probably in Mesopotamia at some point. And I say that not only on the basis of the date, which is to say about 1,000 years before our biblical texts, um, but also I think kind of just from the concept of the way creation works, right? Who living in Israel would think, you know how about the world began as a watery chaos, right? I probably watery is not the way that an Israelite would have imagined the world to have started off. They might have imagined more like dry and dusty, which we'll get to at the end of today when we look at Genesis 2. Okay, enough with the comparative, but as always, I think really useful to sort of have in mind what is original to the Bible, what's fundamental to the Bible, and what is simply part of their cultural heritage. I want to point out that Genesis 1, and I said something like this last time, is not a self-contained unit. It doesn't exist just for its own sake, as if somebody said, I just need to write a creation story. Why would somebody writing a longer text start with creation at all? Why do we have a creation story to begin with? One of the things to think about here is what's the purpose of the Pentateuch or the Torah as a whole? Based simply on the amount of material devoted, the promulgation of the laws, the ritual laws of Leviticus or the sort of more civil laws of Exodus and Deuteronomy, right? The laws seem to have been the central feature of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. And giving us the framework for the laws would seem to be the main purpose, at least literarily, behind the historical writings that come before them. So everything in Genesis on. Right, these stories that we read, like Genesis 1, weren't written to be independently sort of analyzed for their theological for their theological claims. Right? They were part of a bigger whole of which the laws were the central part. There's a famous the famous medieval Jewish interpreter called Rashi, who famously asked in his commentary on Genesis 1:1, the first thing he says is, why don't we start in Exodus 12, which is where the first laws are in Jewish tradition? Why don't we start in Exodus 12? Why do we have this whole book and a half beforehand? Why do we start here? And the answer that he gives is because we need to understand why we have the law. How did we get here? How did it become the case that Israel has these laws specifically? And the historical background gives us the answer to that question. You can see how this works in Genesis 1 in particular, because all these separations and categorizations that I talked about earlier, what we find in Genesis 1 becomes the basis for separation and categorization later when Israel actually receives specific laws. So we get the creation of the lights to serve as signs for set times and days and years, and those set times aren't effective in any way until Leviticus. Right? When Israel gets to Sinai, God says, okay, so I established the system for identifying set times back at creation, and I didn't do anything with it until now. And now I'm going to give you laws that take those into account. Similarly, of course, the animals being created in their various kinds becomes the basis for the kosher laws that will come up also in Leviticus. And most obviously, the Sabbath on the seventh day when God rests right? And God sanctifies that day and doesn't tell anybody what to do with that sanctification. What's anybody supposed to do on the Sabbath now that God has sanctified it on the seventh day? Nobody knows until God gives laws to Israel at Sinai and says, here's what you're going to do on the Sabbath day. You're going to rest in order to sanctify it. Uh, what I want to say about the Sabbath while I'm here, I want to point out that uh, there's something unique about the Sabbath in that it is the only sort of one of the festivals or times that is kind of given all the way at the beginning, right? Uh, God will give a calendar for all of the festivals in Leviticus and say, okay, so in whatever month, on whatever day, you celebrate this festival. But Sabbath has to happen in Genesis 1 at creation because Sabbath isn't tied to the moon. It's not tied to right, what anchors the seventh day. The only anchor for the seventh day is creation. Right? Our weeks just have to go back infinitely. So Sabbath has to be created in the process of creation. The seventh day has to be like noticed because we have been counting ever since, or at least God has been counting ever since. So Sabbath has a sort of distinctive standing that goes all the way back to creation. Okay, moving on to the section of the chapter that I think is probably of main interest for most people, which is people, the creation of people. And there's so much going on in this section of the text. I'm sure I won't be able to get to all of the things that are of interest, but we'll start with the beginning. Let us make man in our image, says the text. So let's start with the easy part, which is the word man here is the Hebrew word for the generic species, right? Humankind, mankind, humanity. So it's not let us make man a single individual in our image. It's let us make this species of human. That's what that man means. Now let's get to the hard part. Let us make. Who us? Who us? Right? There is no royal we in Hebrew. Right? That's not a thing. It is a lovely thing for people to sort of say as a explanation, but it doesn't really work because it doesn't actually exist. So when God says, let us make man in our image, to whom is God speaking? The best, most likely suggestion is that God is speaking to a sort of heavenly court of divine beings, which does not imply, right, some sort of polytheistic worldview, right? We're talking about divine messengers, what we might today call angels, or various lesser divine beings. In the same way that I imagine that people who believe in the existence of various angels today are still basically monotheistic. Same idea here. It's God as king, and there's a heavenly court around the deity. This isn't. We don't have to like make that up. It's the notion of God in the heavenly court is referred to a bunch of times in the Bible. You may think of in the book of Isaiah when he has his vision of going to and sees God on the throne, and there's all these things floating around him. There's seraphs and various divine beings who are up there also. There are psalms that make clear that there is a divine court. Point is, the idea that God is speaking to a bunch of other divine beings is something that early interpreters of the Bible had absolutely no problem with. And I also have absolutely no problem with it. If some of us today don't love the idea of a heavenly court because it doesn't comport with our notion of the deity or how the deity works, exists, whose problem is that really? Is it our problem or is it the Bible's problem? And I think keeping that in mind is always useful. Okay, so that's let us make man in our image. In the image of God, he created him. So again, start with the easy part. The him there, in the image of God, he created him. The him there is, the pronoun refers back to humanity. So in the image of God, he created humanity. so that's the so really it should be in the image of God who created it, right? It's the generic, not an individual. The hard part in this verse is the phrase "the image of God." Now, those of us who hold a modern anti-anthropomorphic notion of God run into kind of a real problem here. What does this image of God mean? Um, well, maybe we can interpret it as meaning self-conscious or creative, right? Imbued with a creative spirit like God is. Perhaps created in the image of God means with a sort of divine authority over the earth, right? Which is not far off from what the rest of the verse might suggest. I want to put out there that in the Hebrew Bible, there is no problem with the idea that in the image of God means actual physical resemblance, right? The notion that humans look like God, or to do it the other way, of course, God looks like humans, right? God is anthropomorphic. We can think of all of the times that the Bible refers to God's hand and God's arm and even God's feet. Moses sees God's back. God walks. God rests. God stands. All of these things that are clearly anthropomorphic language. We've sort of been taught to think of those as like metaphors, not true. But that's because we've also been taught that that's not what God is like. Ancient Israelites, I think, thought that's exactly what God was like. And so when they said made in the image of God, they understood this is what we look like. We look like this because God looks like that. God sits in his throne, right, and wears clothes, and all of these things. If we jump ahead a few chapters, we'll notice that Adam also has a son in his likeness after his image, using the same exact words we find in Genesis 1. Again, I think what that means is kids look like their parents, right? That's and that I think is what's happening back in Genesis 1 also. I think it's important when we read, and I'm not suggesting there's a correct answer to this, but I think it's important when we read to recognize uh, our interpretive difficulties with the text as opposed to the text's problems, right? An anthropomorphic deity is not a problem in the text. It's a problem for us in the way that we want to interpret the text. And so it becomes our responsibility to interpret it in ways that conform to the rest of our sort of belief system. It's not the text's job to conform to our 20th century or even 2,000-year-old way of thinking. Right? The notion of an omnipresent, invisible, omniscient, omnipotent God is not at all native to the Hebrew Bible. It's a product of Greek philosophical ideas, particularly Neoplatonism. And we get conflicts out of the fact that we're inheriting an ancient Near Eastern text and Greco-Roman interpretive frameworks. Right? And those two things just simply don't always go together. And part of our task as readers is to figure out how to deal with those things. Okay. Once humanity is created, God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." And a common interpretation of this is as commanding fertility, right? So traditional Judaism takes it this way, right? We'll read in the Talmud that men are commanded to procreate. Obviously, there are some Christian movements and sects that take it the same way, and this first becomes sometimes a cultural weapon used against people who choose not to have children. I know I have colleagues who have taught at some traditional, say, Catholic universities who, by being childless, are stigmatized, right? It's assumed that they are making a choice that goes against tradition. What's at stake here, though, is really the issue of command versus blessing, right? The grammar here is a command, be fruitful and multiply. But the context is God blessed them, right? So is it a command or a blessing? If it's a blessing, then lots of interpreters read this as, okay, well, if fertility is a blessing, then infertility must be a curse. And so right, this seemingly nice thing of being blessed with fertility, again, gets turned into something that's not so nice in certain contexts for certain bodies. Right? Inability to bear children creates the notion of, well, you must be cursed. We even see this idea in the Bible itself. Right? We think of some of the barren matriarchs, or even better, the story of Hannah, Samuel's mother, when she can't have children, and her rival wife sort of, taunts her, right, and says, God has cursed you. So I want to suggest that what we're looking at here is not, in fact, a command to the first humans to procreate, and is never, in fact, an individual command or a single generation sort of thing. It's a very long-range blessing, right? This is a blessing for lineages rather than for individuals, right? Adam and Noah, it makes sense for them to receive this blessing because they actually sort of have to procreate and fill the earth to a certain extent. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all received the blessing of being fruitful and multiplying, in part because they have to sort of, right, we have to make sure that the line continues in the right order. But after Jacob, no one will ever receive this blessing again. Right? Jacob's sons will go on to become progenitors of entire Israelite tribes, and not a single one of them is ever told, be fruitful and multiply. Right? They're covered by the fact that Jacob is told, be fruitful and multiply. So what I want to suggest about this verse is, it looks simple and sometimes nice, right? It's blessing, be fruitful and multiply. But I think that it has been used in some problematic ways. I even co-wrote an entire book about this, about fertility and infertility in the Bible, should you care to look it up. What I want to say here in closing is that be fruitful and multiply isn't a command that was given long in the past that is still applicable to us today, that like we're still being commanded to be fruitful and multiply. It was a blessing in the past that explains the present. Why are there people all over the world? Because God blessed our ancestors with fertility. In other words, this blessing has been fulfilled many, many times over. Right? In the Bible itself, it's fulfilled by the end of Genesis. By the end of Genesis, it says, and Israel was fruitful and multiplied and filled the earth. And by the end of Genesis, as I said, no individual will ever receive this blessing again. Right? We're good. It's done. So individuals in the present, now 3,000 years later, aren't required to multiply greatly, not even required to multiply at all. It's a collective blessing on humanity and on the descendants of Abraham and his children. And we, as humanity, fulfilled the blessing, not the command, of Genesis 1:28. Fertility isn't actually like a blessing for individuals, and more importantly, infertility isn't a curse. You don't need to be fertile or have children in order to be blessed. Okay. I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure that I finish off here with thinking about what happens when we are reading through Genesis 1, and then we get to Genesis 2, and we thought we understood how creation worked, and it turned out we understood nothing. We're trained to read the text canonically, right? We are trained to read it as a continuous whole thought. And so we gloss over the sharp, sort of abrupt shift that happens between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, if you ask some random person to tell you how creation worked in the Bible, everyone's like, oh yeah, it's easy, right? Right, in the beginning, God created, and then there's days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on day 7, God rested, and then Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's like, yes, that's the order of the text, but how does that work? Those things don't actually go together. We get in Genesis 2 a very, very different picture of creation. So in Genesis 1, it opened with this primordial watery chaos, but Genesis 2 tells us that the earth is dry and dusty at first. In Genesis 1, humanity is created at the very end of the process. In Genesis 2, of course, humanity is created at the very beginning. In Genesis 1, humanity is created and told to fill the whole earth, right? And then in Genesis 2, weirdly, man is restricted just to this one garden and isn't really filling the earth anymore. Besides, how is that one dude supposed to fill the earth all by himself anyway? In Genesis 1, animals are created before humanity. In Genesis 2, they're created after and on behalf of, for the sake of humanity. In Genesis 1, of course, male and female are created simultaneously. In Genesis 2, also famously, females are created from the side of that one dude who happens to be hanging around. Genesis 1, creation takes 6 days. In Genesis 2, it's just one day where it all happens. How do we explain these differences? More than differences, how do we explain these outright contradictions? Both of these accounts can't really be true in a literal sense, right? Right. Both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can't have happened quite. So we might try to interpret these contradictions away, right? We might say, as traditions have for a long time, that Genesis 1 is sort of more this like spiritual notion of creation, and Genesis 2 is actually the physical creation, right? How it really happened. We can say that. We could come up with all sorts of, we could say, Genesis 1 happened, and then fast forward a while, and now we're into Genesis. You can do all sorts of twists and turns to make it work. But anything we say in order to sort of relieve the contradictions between the two texts is admitting that there are contradictions between the two texts, right? In the attempt to level Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 into a single coherent story is actually reading against the biblical text, right? The Bible gives us two creation stories, two very different creation stories with different claims about what happened and when and how and why, right? The whole thing. And there's not just, there's bigger stuff involved here, right? You could make whole arguments about the environmental movement based on Genesis 1, where everything in the world is created before humanity, and the animals are told to be fruitful and multiply even before people are, right? So animal rights is in there too. You could do gender equality questions, right? There's vast differences between the two stories, not just in their details, but in their big, larger imports. You can't really combine them in such a way that does justice to each of them as their own thing. So as I said, I'm going to talk more about Genesis 2 on its own terms next time. Here, I really wanted to just introduce the notion that the Bible, even in the first 2 chapters, has multiple authors. Multiple authors with different ideas and different traditions and different stories and themes and theology. And that's not just okay, it's more than okay. It's actually central to what the Bible is and to what Genesis is. And I'll come back to this more in a couple of weeks. But I want to note that we are like so culturally trained to blend stories into a single sort of lowest common denominator narrative that we, like, even when they don't actually work together, we still do this and end up missing some stuff. Genesis 2 is obviously all about the creation of the first man and the first woman, man first and woman second. And Genesis 1, as we saw, had simultaneous creation of male and female. Here's the fun part, right? Because we have all mentally done a thing in combining these two stories, and therefore missed, I think, like a really cool part of Genesis 1. The question is this: how many humans did God create in Genesis 1? The obvious answer is 2, right? God created 2 humans, male and female. But why do we think that God only created 2 humans in Genesis 1? Right? Before the humans, God created all the fish, right? All the different kinds of fish. Do we think that God created like 2 salmon and 2 trout, like male and female, and 2 shrimp, and just like only 2? Or then God created the land animals, just like 2 cows and 2 horses and 2 elephants, 2 eagles and 2 sparrows, right? That's all God created on day 1. I don't think actually most of us even really think that. I think we understand that when God created all of the other bits of the animal kingdom in Genesis 1, he created entire species. Right? God's starting to populate the earth. And God says, be fruitful and multiply, not because there's just 2 of them, but as a blessing, right? May you continue to increase and fill the earth. So when God creates humanity and creates not individual, but the species, humanity, and creates them male and female and says, I'm blessing you, be fruitful and multiply, how many humans did God create? Not two. God created the entire species of humanity on day 6 of Genesis 1. So why do we instinctively reading Genesis 1 go, oh yeah, male and female created two? Right? Just two individuals. Why do we think that? Because we think that Genesis 1 is talking about the two individuals from Genesis 2. But we know it isn't. I mean, they're totally different stories. And besides, in Genesis 2, he doesn't create two, male and female, at the same time, but only one, and then eventually gets around to another one. Right? These stories may be next to each other, but that's all they are. They're just next to each other. We as readers blend them together, usually not so well, but we shouldn't blend them into a single story. The Bible doesn't blend them into a single story, right? We get one take on creation, and then we get another take on creation. Okay, so my final thought for today, we need as readers to be constantly conscious about where and how we're imposing our own interpretive frameworks onto the text. And with any luck, part of what we're going to do over the next few weeks together is become more aware of just how present and prominent our interpretive frameworks are in our understanding of Genesis. Okay, I'm going to take the rest of the time to address any questions that folks may have had over the course of what I was just saying. And I also want to, I want to say thank you for bearing with me. There are times when I get excited about this stuff and I end up talking fast. And it's in part because I have so many things I want to get across, and in part because that's how I get when I get excited. So apologies. Fortunately, it's all being recorded, and if you missed some stuff, you can always go back and rewatch or read or see my conversation with John and get an even slightly different take. Okay, questions. Let me see. Kelly, do you want to do this? Have you been following these, or shall I?
I asked people to send them to you directly, and I forwarded some to you as well.
Okay, good. Um, so uh, let's see what I got here. Okay, so I've got a few people who ask questions um, about the composition of the Pentateuch and about Genesis, and who are already like using language in terms that I haven't introduced yet, in terms of like questions about authorship and who wrote the text and who the various authors are. And I'm like, I've alluded to that today, right? That there's two authors, one in Genesis, one in Genesis 2, but I'm holding off on like the full conversation about that for a couple of weeks until probably we get to the flood. So so bear with me on that. I promise I will talk about the composition of the Pentateuch and of Genesis. Um, and so I appreciate those. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Is it a wind from God, somebody asked, or can it just be a mighty wind in that very sort of lovely traditional interpretation? This is a sort of a question of translation, right? It says literally a wind of God, but sometimes of God can be used to mean, right, something like mighty or strong. Uh, I think in this case it's it's divine, but it's honestly this is simply a question of translation. Um, a few questions about the wind that I got. Where does the wind come from? I think it comes from God. God uses winds creatively and destructively all the time in the Bible, and I think that's just what's going on here. Uh, let's see here. Other things that I looks like I nicely answered a bunch of the questions that came in here in the course of my doing this. Um, right. So a few people asking about the relative dating of the Mesopotamian text and the biblical text and how we know. Uh, one of the things that I say often is it's very difficult to date biblical texts, especially those of the Pentateuch. Uh, but it's not, it's difficult to date them precisely and not so difficult to give them rough ranges. Uh, we don't have almost any Israelite literary production of any kind, biblical or non-biblical, from before roughly the 10th century BC. Mesopotamia has writing that goes back 2,000 plus years earlier than that. So a few people reacted to me saying that the Mesopotamian creation story is older than the biblical one, and I think that that's not a hard case to make. Actually, it's not just their writing; it's the civilization as a whole. Mesopotamian civilization again goes back into the 4th millennium and beyond BCE, whereas Israel as a cultural unit and certainly as a nation of any sort, we can't trace back before the 12th century BCE. So we certainly have a pretty wide cultural gap between the two things. Um, uh, One of the things that people are asking about is about more about the creation of male and female simultaneously. Uh, Lots of ways to understand that. As I said, my suggestion is that God is creating the entire species, both males and females within it. Um, uh, and I should add, by the way, the creation of humans as male and female is another example of a categorization and separation being instituted in Genesis 1 that has no practical ramifications until much later in the text. Right? There are no there's nothing in that is specific to male or female within this author's concept until we get sort of really like a variety of sexual laws in Leviticus. So it's another one that was like a categorization that was planted at the beginning that has no practical ramifications until Israel is given specific Israelite laws later in the story. But the male and female thing is obviously a very complicated, interpretive question. Uh, Perhaps most famously, uh, some of the early Jewish rabbis or interpreters read the male and female simultaneous creation as God having created sort of a hermaphrodite first, right? A creature that had, or not even quite, a creature that had like faced both ways, right? A male side and a female side. Um, which may have been borrowed in part from some Greek philosophical discussions also. Um, uh, so these are some of the variety of possible ways to think about that. Um, uh, right. Let's see here. Right. People keep on asking me about the sources. I'm not there yet. Um, uh, right. Why are the two stories of Genesis included in the Bible? Why have two different stories? How was it decided and by whom to include these two stories in the canon? I love that question. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds on sort of, again, the process of composition and editing. And I promise there's no way we're not going to get there. It's like the main thing that I do is think about that. Um, but uh, but I love the question because what it gets at is, what is this thing that we're reading? What is Genesis? Right? If we think of the Bible as a unified sort of single message kind of thing, then yeah, why would we have two different stories? Um, right? What's the idea here? And honestly, from the very first two chapters of the entire Bible, we are told structurally and in terms of content that this is not, in fact, what the Bible is meant to be. Right? It's not meant to be a single, continuous, right, absolutely logically coherent presentation of the one absolute truth. right from chapters 1 and 2, we're essentially told this is a collection. It's a collection of traditions and of texts and of ideas and stories and theological perspectives. Um, we can ask all sorts of questions about what the circumstances are under which such a a thing may have been created. But at the very least, what we can probably assume, and I'll get into this more in future weeks, but we can probably assume is that both of these creation stories, and again, not just these stories, but all of the texts that were attached to them, that like these are the introductions to larger works, not their own thing, but that these stories were at some point both considered to be authoritative in some way. That's not particularly weird to think about if we were to sort of look at the if you were to pick up sort of a collection of Greek mythology, for example. I don't want to try and make a one-to-one comparison, but more on the cultural level. If you picked up a collection of Greek mythology, you would probably find that you can't really create a single through story of like everything that happened, with all of the gods and all the humans. There's various takes on various aspects of the origins of culture or different stories, all of which made it into sort of the culture's understanding. Um, this really goes back to our way of reading and understanding the Bible. Right? What we think the Bible is not necessarily what ancient Israelites thought the Bible was, or what the various bits and pieces that went into that like make up the Bible. Um, right? We read the Bible as you know as being a certain thing, and what that thing is depends on the faith traditions we come out of. But those are the positions of our various faith traditions that say this is what the Bible is. It's not what the ancient Israelites would have thought. Right? Ancient Israelites weren't Christians. They weren't Jews. They were, members of an ancient Near Eastern culture, and that's the, that's what we're dealing with. Um, okay, I'm going to try and sneak one more in here. Somebody, I like somebody. I'm just going to read. Somebody said, "Do you believe that Genesis was plagiarized?" No, that's not right. Cultural borrowing is obviously all over the place. We have tons of cultural borrowing that we do without being conscious of it at all. It's not this isn't plagiarism. Um, uh, Somebody asked which versions I'm using for the biblical text. I think most of my translations are from the Jewish Publication Society version. The other one I recommend is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. Those are the two that most biblical scholars tend to use. Uh, there are plenty of other good ones. Does Genesis, I'm going to do a quick hitters here. Does Genesis 1:29 mean primitive veganism before Genesis 3? It sure does. And it's not just before Genesis 3, but in the mind of this author, we'll get here in a couple of weeks, it's veganism all the way until the flood. When there's an explicit reference back to here after the flood, and God says, in addition to all the stuff you've been eating so far, now I'm going to let you eat some meat. Um, and then the biggest question, somebody said, how do you read this text religiously and critically? And I'm afraid we're just out of time. This is what we're doing. This is what we're going to be doing the whole time, right? Is sort of exploring those kinds of gray areas. Again, it's not about you have to read it one way or the other, right? My academic mentor is an Orthodox Jew who lives in the West Bank, right? Like he's not religious. He also taught me absolutely how to read all of this critically. And this is sort of what I was saying, right? There's ways of reading that may feel like challenges to certain faith claims, but they're so respectful of the text as the biblical text. Right? I'm not trying to flatten. Right? Genesis 1 and 2 are very, very different. If I tried to flatten them into one single conceptual like unity, I'm doing the text an enormous disservice. right? I'm not, that's not what the Bible is doing. I'd be, as I said, reading against the Bible, reading against the text of Genesis. And I am like, I firmly believe that we can both read as serious biblical readers and take seriously the form of the text and its structure and the way it presents itself and the contradictions it leaves in for us, and not try to iron those out in some way. We can both do that, and in doing that, sort of maintain a faithfulness to the text, right? That is faithfulness to the text. And I do think it's possible to hold a critical reading and a my faith tradition says I should read it this way reading at the same time, and understand that these are just two different parts of our brain, or two different questions we're asking about the text. Um, what it meant and what it means now don't have to be the same thing. And actually, as long as we keep in mind that, like, what it means now shouldn't necessarily affect what we say it meant back then, and vice versa. What we say it meant back then doesn't necessarily affect what we say it means now. We're honoring both sides, really. The problem comes when we say, oh, so you're saying back in 3,000 years ago it meant this, therefore it must mean that, and you're challenging my faith. Nope, I'm not saying that. But same way, I say it means this now, which means 3,000 years ago it must have meant what I say it means now, is equally problematic. So, like, maintaining these two sort of modes of thinking about the text, I think gives us the opportunity to honor both ways of reading. And with that, I encourage everybody to, again, we're going to be reading Genesis 2 and 3, the Garden of Eden, for next time. You should have read Genesis 2 for this time also. Reread it now, continuing on. Again, go to the Yale Bible Study website, check out the conversation between me and Professor Collins, check out the readings, and let me know if you have any questions in the interim that I didn't get to. And I'll be seeing you all in a week.